Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is having a lovely day. Welcome to Working with Incarcerated Survivors of Sexual Abuse Perpetrated by Women. Today's webinar will provide some guidance on best approaches for providing support services to incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by women. I think contrary to popular perception, sexual abuse in both adult and youth detention facilities is often committed by women. So today, we're going to be discussing the incidents and dynamics of sexual abuse perpetrated by women in detention settings, including some of the major barriers of this type of abuse in terms of getting help. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A, but as Mackenzie said, please feel free to send your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. We may, if it makes sense, answer them in the spot, or if not, save them for the end, but feel free to send those as they come up. And also engage with us in the chat. We're going to have a couple of questions that we ask you all, but in the meantime, please definitely feel free to introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from, and I see a couple of you have already started to do that, so thank you so much. We're really happy to have you today. My name is Nicole de la Torre. I'm a program director at Just Detention International. Cynthia and I are both joining you all from, I guess I could say, they're DC suburbs in Maryland, but we're both part of JDI's DC office. So I'll have Cynthia unmute herself so she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Totten. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been with JDI for many years. It's great to see so many of you on, and looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. And I see a lot of familiar names on our panel or attendees list here, but for those of you who might be new to JDI's work, Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention. Our core goals are to hold government officials accountable for this type of abuse, to change the public attitudes about sexual violence behind bars, and to ensure that survivors get the help they need. Our core principle is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Just a reminder that this webinar is one of a 13-part series focused on providing accessible services for currently and formerly incarcerated survivors who are from particularly underserved groups. So if you're not already on our mailing address or mailing list, please send us your name and email address via the chat, and we'll make sure to add you so that you don't miss announcements on future webinars. Sorry about that. And then I just wanted to kind of quickly review what the objectives for this webinar today are. So we'll be discussing or reviewing some of the dynamics of sexual abuse perpetrated by women, and that includes staff and staff that are women and incarcerated people who are women perpetrators in detention. While some of these can be similar to dynamics in the community, we'll think about the dynamics of abuse perpetrated by women in the context of detention, which, as we know, can be a very hyper-masculine environment. We'll identify particular challenges for survivors of this abuse, including some cultural biases and reporting challenges, and we'll learn strategies for making support services more accessible and meaningful to survivors of this type of abuse. A quick thank you to the Office on Violence Against Women for their support in this work. And a quick reminder to you all to take care of yourselves today during and after this training, whatever that means for you. If you want to be off camera or take breaks, feel free to do that. We encourage you to do so. And so with that, we will get started, and I will pass things to Cynthia.
Thank you, Nicole. Oops, sorry. Great. So let's start off the webinar today by taking a few moments to clarify who are we talking about when we say incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse whose abuse was perpetrated by a woman. and the statistics that we have that highlight the prevalence of this issue. Okay. Oops, sorry. It's very sensitive. Okay, so when we're giving any training or workshop like this, something that we at JDI always like to mention is the language that we use and why we use it. Language is just one of the many steps, one of the many considerations that we need to take into account when we think about culture change. And when we change our language, it's vital that we also change our behavior accordingly. So how we talk about people and discuss issues can adapt over time, and many of these changes also help reflect the wholeness and humanity of the people who we work with. While we choose to use person-first language at JDI, we know that often this is not the language that's used in statistics or in detention environments, or perhaps in some of the reports that you might read. We use these person-first terms like person who is incarcerated or incarcerated person, rather than inmate, offender, or other terms like that. While people may define their experiences in a myriad of ways, we'll be using the term survivor rather than victim. We will also be using the term man and woman rather than male and female in order to reflect gender terms rather than terms that are focused on sex assigned at birth. Great. Oh, let's see. Okay, great. So let's share out. Why do you think it's important to specifically talk about the experiences of survivors who were abused by women? Why does it matter to you to be part of this conversation today? And you can put your thoughts into, I guess the Q&A is probably the best place, so that we have one place where things are going.
I think, sorry, just to jump in,
Okay.
the
Yeah.
chat is actually might be easier.
Oh, okay,
You
great.
can see, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. So yeah, use the chat. And so we're starting to get some thoughts. Yeah, stigma, right? It's not talked about enough. Often it's unheard of. People don't even quite have an awareness many times that this is something that happens. People might think it's not possible. We need to debunk the myth that it's only men who perpetrate sexual abuse. That's right. And we need to debunk the myth that men can't be sexually assaulted, right? Or that men are not, cannot be survivors of this type of trauma, or that they're not deserving of help if they are. People often don't believe a woman could be a perpetrator. Absolutely. Sexual abuse by women against men in prison is often framed as a relationship. Wow, I feel like you're quoting us, Sarah. That's exactly how we would have described that, right? That sexual abuse by women against men in prison is often framed as something that's consensual. And in fact, yes, that does often happen when we look at our news coverage on this issue, and we see terms like relationship, and sort of assumptions, right, that this was not something that involved coercion, and particularly the fact that there just is no possibility of something completely consensual in a detention setting. And yes, Jamie, we appreciate your acknowledgement about the person-first terminology. Great. So those are really helpful. I think you guys seem to, be coming into this having quite a strong understanding of the issue. Great. So let's just to clarify a little bit more. Oh, someone just added, Skyla added, it's important because all survivors deserve to be heard and believed. Wow, I'm just loving this. You guys are on it. You get it. And absolutely, right? Every survivor deserves to be seen, get services, believed, taken seriously. Absolutely. Okay, so who are we talking about? We're talking about survivors who are abused by women staff, right, in facilities for men or boys or women or girls, right? So any sort of facility, you're going to have some women staff. And so by thinking about, when we're talking about sexual abuse perpetrated by women, we mean both women staff in any type of facility. And then in facilities for women or girls, we're talking about abuse that is perpetrated by incarcerated women or incarcerated girls. So we just want to kind of clarify that. So we're still lacking a lot of information and data around the issue, even though a lot of great research has been done around sexual abuse in detention in the last, several decades, and especially in the last, I would say, 15 years or so by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in particular. We still need more information. And so in particular, while we know that abuse by women affects incarcerated transgender people, for example, much of the data that exists does not give us a robust picture of how this abuse has impacted transgender men, transgender women, and non-binary people. And additionally, there's still limited data on intimate partner violence between women who are incarcerated. So talking there about, women who are incarcerated and may become involved in some sort of relationship or partnership with each other. And at any point, this is a lot. And so if you have any question, please do feel free to ask any question in the chat so that we can get to it. So why is this issue so important? So, we know that sexual abuse is an act of violence that frequently leaves lasting effects. While often sexual abuse in our society is associated with the idea of men as perpetrators, sexual abuse perpetrated by women, unfortunately, does happen. And at this point, it's prevalent, but it's still under-recognized. Contrary to popular misconceptions, sexual abuse by women is not a rare occurrence. This underrepresentation is partly attributed to societal perceptions and biases, which often portray women as survivors rather than perpetrators. And so what we end up having is this kind of dichotomy where it's assumed that, women, with respect to sexual violence, women are always the victims and men are always the perpetrators, right? And so we need to shift that and have a more nuanced sort of analysis. Survivors of abuse perpetrated by women face a unique set of challenges and a tremendous amount of stigma. And I use the word unique. I don't know if that's the right word that I actually would use now that I think about it. I think that there are some particular challenges that might feel a little bit different when one has been abused by women. But I do think that for the most part, the challenges, the pain, the road to healing, that a lot of that actually crosses over for both. So sexual abuse in any circumstance can cause feelings of disbelief and confusion and shame. But there is, of course, this kind of additional layer of societal stigma around abuse committed by women that can further compound that survivor's suffering, right? So all survivors suffer, of course, and sexual abuse is always horrible, but there can be an additional piece with that societal stigma when one is a man who has been, abused by a woman, or a woman who's been abused by a woman. And those survivors then may encounter disbelief, denial, and even some level of blame. Survivors who are men are particularly at risk of being marginalized and invalidated. Their experiences are often dismissed or minimized due to ingrained gender stereotypes that we tend to hold that depict men as perpetrators and women as survivors. And so, of course, that lack of recognition and support worsens the trauma that survivors of abuse by women go through. So all of this, of course, can be exacerbated in settings like prisons and jails, where safety and healing are not centered. And as Nicole pointed out, which can often be sort of hyper-masculine type of environments, and environments where toxic masculinity rules the day, typically. All right, so a little bit of data. We're not going to get into too much. Oh, I'm sorry, Nicole. I'll turn it back to you for a little bit of data.
That's okay, no worries. And I don't know if others are experiencing this, but my language keeps changing. So apologies if I seem a little flustered at some point, but my audio keeps changing from English to Spanish. Um, so yeah, just to, as Cynthia said, just to talk a little bit about some data, and these numbers, to be clear, are from the community at this point. We wanted to take a look at some of the numbers to really put this, issue into perspective. And so what we know is that about 1 in 4 men in the US experience some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 14 are made to penetrate someone during their lifetime. So again, these are community numbers, but so they're not specific to detention, but it really helps to sort of set the stage. As you can see, these are incredibly high rates of sexual abuse against men, and yet it's not really an issue that goes or it is an issue that goes unnoticed and under acknowledged for a lot of the reasons that some of you shared earlier. So now let's kind of talk about what detention settings can be like and set the stage for that a bit. And of course, keep in mind what we just talked about in terms of the rates of abuse against men being high. So we know that men make up a vast majority of the incarcerated population, 93% of state prison populations, for example. And we know that those numbers are also high in federal prison systems and jails, as well as in youth facilities. Prisons are often characterized by a hyper-masculine environment where traditional notions of masculinity are emphasized and enforced. The prison culture is often one of violence and aggression, where any sign of weakness can make you a target, where people are expected to, quote unquote, prove themselves. And where sexual contact with a woman is typically seen as a sign of power. So this can also be true in women's facilities, but we'll talk a little bit more about the dynamics in women's facilities. There's some differences, but these power structures exist there as well. As we've talked about in this series, and we'll continue to explore more deeply in future webinars, our correctional systems are deeply rooted in systemic racism, where Black men are overrepresented and face ongoing discrimination and oppression. We also know that the power dynamics in detention are intensified, probably more than anywhere else. Perpetrators can literally hold the keys to a survivor's room. They can control their every move. They can use their authority as leverage against pretty much anything, but adding time to their sentence, putting them in the hole, as they call it, or isolation. And they just control a lot of other situations that they can use as leverage. So really the power dynamics behind bars are incredibly intensified. So what do we know, or what data do we have on perpetration by women in facilities? So this is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics surveys. They survey prisons and jails across the country. And we can see that, and this is for adults specifically, but we can see that the rates of sexual abuse between incarcerated women are much higher than incarcerated men. So you could see the, in incarcerated and abuse that happened between incarcerated people, for the percentage of women who were the perpetrators of that abuse is extremely high compared to men.
I wonder, is it okay if while they take care of that, if I answer the question that Melinda posed in the Q&A? Melinda asked,
great idea.
Yeah, Melinda asked, how does JDI or the research differentiate sexual contact between two women who both define their own contact as consensual, though statutorily defined as abuse, to avoid further stigmatizing, criminalizing lesbian and bisexual women? So we as JDI recognize that consensual sexual contact can occur between two people who are incarcerated, right? So certainly, two people who are incarcerated can have a consensual relationship, even though the administrative rules at facilities around the country would deem that type of contact to be against the rule, to be a disciplinary violation. Under the law, any sexual contact between a staff and an incarcerated person cannot be consensual. And that doesn't really matter regardless of the gender of the staff and the gender of the person who's incarcerated. So that's the differentiation there. It's basically recognizing that, sure, two incarcerated people can be involved in something that's consensual. Sometimes it's consensual, sometimes it's not. But when it comes to staff and incarcerated people, there's a very bright line where, for reasons that we'll discuss, there is no differentiation. There is no such thing as consensual contact. And yes, that is separated in the statistics. You're able to see rates of abuse by staff and rates of abuse by incarcerated people, of other incarcerated people. Okay, go ahead, Nick. Oh, Nicole, sorry.
Yeah, so as we were reviewing these data points from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, when it came to staff perpetrators, they were, closer in terms of the number of perpetrators that were men versus women. But still, I think this can be really surprising to most, because again, women don't fit the typical profile of a sexual assault perpetrator. And when we do think about sexual abuse of women in women's facilities, we tend to assume that it's from staff who are men. So I think, this is always really interesting to kind of analyze. But we'll talk a little bit more about the dynamics of women's facilities shortly, and it might explain why these facilities are easy places for this type of abuse to go unaddressed, and what it makes survivors less likely to see it as abuse and to seek help. Here's what we know about youth facilities. Again, the Bureau of Justice Statistics did national survey of youth facilities, and this is quite disturbing. As you can see, abuse by women staff is quite rampant. 91% of the reported incidents of staff sexual misconduct involved only women perpetrators. And so just incredibly high numbers. And I'll note that here's the sort of bigger picture of that data, but I wanted to note that a lot of the number, the 91% of incidents involving women staff were younger women staff, so maybe late teens, or probably or more like early 20s, and the victims or survivors in those cases a lot of times were older, like teenage boys. So that's a little bit of a different dynamic that you see in youth facilities, but you can see here that in most serious incidents of youth on youth sexual abuse, 68% of incidents involved only boys, while 27% involved only girls. But when you look at the staff perpetrators, you see the 91% that we just highlighted were women staff, while 6% involved men staff. So relative to proportion of all correctional staff, women staff members are really overrepresented in this population of perpetrators. And like I said, we know about the dynamic that in youth facilities, it's a lot of the older boys being abused by the younger women staff. So yeah, I'm going to take a look at some of the chat and questions, but until we get to those, I'll pass it back to Cynthia to talk about some of the dynamics of abuse in women.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for that overview and that data. So there are some patterns in terms of the dynamics of abuse when women staff perpetrate sexual abuse inside the detention facilities that they work in. And so what we want to think about are the ways in which those dynamics impact the way survivors, are able to come forward and receive support, or perhaps not feeling comfortable seeking out support because of that stigma that we talked about earlier. Okay, great. So yeah, let's get your input a little bit again. So one of the things that we know, and we've talked about a little bit already, is that there are a lot of misconceptions that we need to challenge when we're thinking about sexual abuse behind bars. One of the largest ones being that when staff perpetrate sexual abuse, the sexual abuse is often mischaracterized as consensual, and that type of mischaracterization tends to be amplified when the staff person is a woman. We cannot overstate, of course, that there can never be consent between a staff person and an incarcerated person, regardless of their gender. But we wanted to ask you, why do you think there's no such thing as consent between a staff person and an incarcerated person? So yeah, the power dynamic, absolutely, right? And Nicole talked about that a few minutes ago, that essentially staff people control every aspect, every single aspect of life inside, from whether you have access to tampons and pads, to whether you see your kids, to whether you eat, to whether you have your legal papers. I mean, there are so many things that they can do in retaliation. And so much of the time, folks don't report sexual abuse in detention, and retaliation is a big part of the reason why. So it's a matter of that power dynamic and that position of authority, and the ways in which that survivor can be made to feel like it's impossible to resist or challenge those actions of that staff person. That imbalance of power can leave the survivor feeling helpless and trapped and unable to break free from the abuse. So thank you for let me just see here. There were a couple of additional ones. Yeah, there's always a power differential, and consent is already deeply compromised in prison. There are so many non-sexual things a staff person can order them to do that they have no right to say no to. Exactly. And we know about, searches and all of the ways in which, detention can already be a highly triggering environment, especially for survivors of sexual abuse. So that even a pat search that's done in the proper way can end up feeling very invasive and potentially triggering and harmful to a person, especially one who has experienced abuse before. And so then when you think about what happens in a situation where there's been, or where there is sexual contact between those two, that in some ways those levers of power become, all the more, making it all the more difficult for that survivor to report, to say no, to change their mind, all of the things that we emphasize that we in the broader community have an absolute right to do at any point, right? All the way up until any particular sexual act is being carried out. We have a right to say no, and you don't end up maintaining that power when you're in a detention setting. When it comes to a situation with staff. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about abuse by women staff and what some of those dynamics were that I was mentioning a second ago. So despite the fact that sexual activity between staff and incarcerated people is clearly prohibited, the stereotype is so ingrained that many survivors report that they willingly participated in incidents with staff. As we've stated before, staff have the ultimate power over someone who's incarcerated, and it's 100% their responsibility to never engage in anything sexual with someone in their care. Survivors of abuse by women staff are not lucky, right, as often portrayed, but because of harmful stereotypes, in particular stereotypes that men always want to have sex with anybody, right? That's another commonly perpetuated misconception or misperception. Our society has deeply ingrained gender stereotypes about women and their ability, or in this case, inability to cause harm. Even when it's clear that a woman abused someone, survivors often share that they were told that what happened to them wasn't that bad, and that, it's actually kind of a badge of honor. And that sentiment is particularly strong when the survivor is a man. All of these are nuanced and deeply ingrained stereotypes and misconceptions that most of us and the survivors we work with have been steeped in for our entire lives. It is these things that make it easier for women staff perpetrators to abuse people in their custody and make it so hard for survivors to come forward. And so right, that's sort of the core thing. If we're going to undo this, we have to undo these harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that exist around this issue. Okay. So a quick reflection around boundary violations, which can otherwise be known as grooming, but for various reasons, we prefer the term boundary violations over grooming. So we know that women staff perpetrators often begin their abuse by crafting a feeling of connection and belonging and developing a state of dependence and emotional attachment that makes it difficult for the survivor to question the perpetrator's motives, while the abuser gradually pushes boundaries and normalizes inappropriate behavior. And of course, this dynamic can exist regardless of the gender of the perpetrator, but kind of thinking about, you know, what it is here with women perpetrators in particular, and situations where people may assume, oh, well, you know, there was no physical force, so was there really abuse? But absolutely, and we can see those ways in which abuse can be carried out without, you know, ever lifting a finger in a violent way. So this gradual process can be subtle and confusing, leaving the survivor unsure whether the interactions are wrong. Staff perpetrators often shower the survivor with gifts, attention, special treatment, special favors, creating a sense of obligation to that perpetrator and being in debt to them. This can make it difficult for the survivor to speak up or set boundaries because they fear they will lose those benefits, or that they'll be retaliated against, including by other incarcerated people who may also be getting some benefits, for example, such as drugs or extra food or extra time on the yard, for example. So staff perpetrators often create an environment of secrecy, sometimes threatening the survivor if they reveal what's going on. This isolation and fear make it difficult for the survivor to reach out for help or confide in others. And oftentimes perpetrators blame the survivor for any inappropriate behavior, making that incarcerated survivor feel responsible and ashamed. Staff abusers may mix affection and abuse, making it difficult for the survivor to differentiate between healthy and unhealthy behavior. And overall, the nature of these boundary violations can leave survivors feeling trapped and isolated and unsure of their own reality. It's crucial for advocates to understand these tactics so that they can start to create safe spaces for survivors to come forward, access support, and begin their healing journey. Okay, so we've got here some data around boundary violations. So this is data that the Bureau of Justice Statistics developed around these dynamics. So in this case, this data comes from the youth detention context, right? So, you know, we at JDI hear directly about these dynamics in letters that we receive from survivors, on the hotline that we run for survivors in Michigan and Vermont prisons. But, you know, the Bureau of Justice Statistics gathered information that really mirrors the same thing around these boundary violation tactics. The boundary violations or grooming behaviors occurred in adult facilities and in youth facilities. And this is just some of the data that the BJS collected about in the youth facility context. So often women staff perpetrators use grooming type behaviors to gain trust and control over a person over a period of time. And over 80% of the cases prior to perpetrating sexual abuse, women staff often talked about their personal lives with an incarcerated youth, or they talked about sex and shared sexual stories. Staff who perpetrated abuse also frequently gave special gifts or money, pictures or letters that, you know, target attention or special treatment. Sometimes they give targeted attention or special treatment. And in many cases, the staff also brought in and gave drugs or alcohol or other contraband to people in their care. And so all of those can be part of that sort of boundary violation pathway. Perpetrators employ these manipulative tactics. They create a confusing and contradictory environment for survivors. And of course, especially when you're talking about youth, right? These are people who are not even adults yet, who are in, you know, the vast bulk of cases coming out of traumatic environments. Many of them have been in foster care. So their ability already to be able to sort of confidently name, based on personal life experience, what is abuse, what isn't, how are my caretakers supposed to treat me, right? Those lines in many cases, unfortunately, have already been blurred, and in many cases then leading to the child ending up in the detention system. So, okay, let's see here. So we wanted to share a personal story from the adult context, the adult detention context. So Ivory, he is a heterosexual Black man who was repeatedly sexually assaulted by a corrections officer when he was being held at a Texas state prison. So in a letter to JDI, because Ivory is someone we've been in touch with quite a lot over the years via letter, Ivory wrote that the staff person who abused him began to talk about her childhood. She would tell me things that were so sad, things like how people would take advantage of her. Knowing all of this, I felt a sense of pity for her. And so then what Ivory shared with us is that this officer groped him. She forced him to perform oral sex on her while he was working as a porter. So there he is in his prison job as a porter, taking things from one place to another, and being faced with this woman officer who's forcing him to do things, right? The officer threatened Ivory that if he didn't do what she asked, she would report him for inappropriately touching her. So she was using the threat of like, okay, I'll turn this around and report that you sexually assaulted me. So despite his fears, Ivory reported the abuse. He was told there was nothing there could be done since she was an officer and he was a quote unquote inmate. Eventually, the officer confessed and she was terminated by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and charged with improper sexual activity with a person in custody. Now, the officer stated that the sex was consensual, and TDCJ punished Ivory by writing him up with a disciplinary sanction, which effectively halted his parole process and led to him being transferred to a more dangerous unit where he was then assaulted by gang members. So that shows you how deep and serious this is, right? So he was brave enough to come forward despite the stigma, despite the risk of not being believed. And at first, like once the officer admitted what had happened and confessed to it, Ivory maybe had thought, oh, okay, well, this is good. She's admitted what she's done wrong. But then, she's claiming that it's consensual. And for all the reasons that we've discussed, we know that it couldn't have been consensual. And on top of that, Ivory had all types of, information about how it was not consensual, about how he was sexually assaulted repeatedly. And then look what ended up happening to him, a really horrible outcome. And he said to us that the administration claimed that I was having a consensual sexual relationship with her. As far as I know, she wound up being charged with having improper sexual activity with a person in custody, but it wasn't a consensual relationship. So we really appreciate Ivory's bravery and sharing his story. I'll turn it back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Cynthia. And as we kind of wrap up that section on dynamics of sexual abuse perpetrated by women who are staff, we also just want to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of sexual abuse perpetrated by women who are incarcerated and not staff. Great. So we talked about violence and aggression in detention facilities earlier. And while that also exists in women's facilities, of course, there are some cultural differences that are helpful to understand. So incarcerated people in women's facilities are likely to be part of informal family structures. And these relationships can be essential for people's survival and for their mental health, as they can provide companionship and support people behind bars that often lack that connection and that support. But like in the community, families aren't always healthy, and some of the dynamics of familial abuse we see in the community are often replicated inside detention facilities with the additional power dynamics that we discussed that are part of the prison environment. So we also know that incarcerated women bring with them complex histories of trauma and at times have complicated understanding of what family means and what healthy relationships look like. So when abuse is happening, it's often masked as being love or friendship. Sexual abuse in women's facilities is also usually less physically violent. I think Cynthia mentioned this earlier, but there's less likely to be, use of physical force, which makes it more easy to disguise as consensual. And all of this leads to staff taking the abuse less seriously and perpetuates the lack of understanding of how serious this issue truly is in women's facilities. Let's also review some of the additional dynamics that impact survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by other incarcerated women. So we know that women perpetrators frequently keep people from their family and their support on the outside. They're likely to convince them that their relationship is the most important now, that that their other sort of connections don't matter, or that people have hurt them in the past, but I'm going to take care of you here. They can be very possessive and also isolate survivors from other people in the facility. We know that they frequently use commissary and other financial abuse as a frequent method of control of the people that they are abusing inside, and that they play mental and emotional games around the survivor's crime and their worth, and they use that to make them feel unlovable against with or just kind of as part of their strategies for power and control. All right, so let's do another quick question for you all. So what might survivors of sexual abuse by women in detention, or why might survivors of sexual abuse by women in detention not report or seek help? So if you have an answer, put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. But yeah, why do you think that survivors of sexual abuse by women in detention do not report or seek help? Yeah, so great. Won't be believed, afraid that they will not be believed, fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed, ashamed. Yeah. They don't realize it's abuse. Yep. Afraid that they will be seen as weak. Yeah, absolutely. Fear of not being believed, retaliation, and being put in the hole. Yeah. Great. So I want to quickly share another story from a survivor that we've been in touch with. Beverly was sexually abused by a woman officer in a Texas prison. She was transferred to a maximum security prison far away from her family after reporting the abuse. So, Beverly's story is unfortunately, a common one. It's easier for an agency to transfer a person than to acknowledge and deal with the abuse that's being committed by their own peer. And so what Beverly and so many others, similar stories do is reinforce those fears, as many of you said, fear of reporting because they won't be believed or because they'll face retaliation. So unfortunately, Beverly's story, captures that. All right, so you all had great answers already to barriers to reporting, but let's just go over them a little bit in more detail. So we talked about cultural biases at the top of the webinar, and those are certainly huge barriers for people, particularly for men, to report sexual abuse against women. There's fears that they'll be seen as weak for saying that a woman abused them, that they'll be seen as gay if they're straight for not wanting it, or it can be, again, mischaracterized as consensual because, of course, how could a man, who's been locked up for years, not be willingly participating in the sexual contact with a woman? And if anything, survivors who are men abused by women should see themselves as fortunate, right? Like that's sort of the notion that we hear a lot from society. There's also gender stereotypes that can be a huge barrier to reporting, such as the idea that men are sexually insatiable and that all men, sex is welcome for all men. And so, men might feel embarrassed to report sexual abuse by women. And if they do report and they're believed, they're frequently met with responses that assume that there was no real harm done to them, right? But really, many times they're not believed, and women perpetrators are often seen as the victims, and somehow these incarcerated men coerce them into the sexual contact. And we know, again, we know that staff hold the power and the authority, and so they're the ones responsible for those professional ethical boundaries that they that they made a commitment to when they took these jobs in this field. We also know that homophobia is rampant in detention facilities. And so for survivors who are men, they may be worried again about being perceived as gay for reporting abuse by women, and what that would mean for their safety and their security. For women who are abused by other women, and who might actually be lesbian or bisexual, they might feel like they're not going to be believed because they're gay, and so they're going to think that it was a consensual relationship if they report, when in fact we know that women who are lesbian are at higher risk for sexual abuse by other incarcerated people. And then with that comes the fear of being charged for consensual sex. As we mentioned earlier, consensual sex is a rule violation in detention, and usually comes with a significant disciplinary infraction. So, this fear is compounded if the survivor is trans. Trans women who might be housed in women's facilities and are already being accused of wanting to be there to abuse other women, can make them easy targets because staff are more likely to believe that it was consensual or that they, in fact, were the perpetrators. So that's an additional barrier for incarcerated trans women. And of course, we know retaliation is incredibly common for any survivor who speaks up. But for all of these reasons that we just discussed, it's even more true for survivors of abuse by women. So yeah, thank you all for your great answers. I see that some of them have kept rolling in. Fear of not being believed, yep, anger, great. All right, so I'm going to pass things back to Cynthia to talk about some approaches to supporting survivors of this abuse.
Thanks, Nicole. So before moving on, I just wanted to go back to a question that Jane posed, which was, I was under the impression that even if an incarcerated person wanted to have a sexual relationship, that they can't legally consent. Why would he be punished? He being Ivory. So as we said, people who are incarcerated cannot consent to a relationship with a staff person, right? There's no such thing as consent. The relationships that can take place between people who are incarcerated are rule violations. They're not necessarily something that's a criminal act. Obviously, Ivory should not have been punished, right? There's no scenario under which it was appropriate to punish Ivory. But that's exactly why we're here, because, all too often, still the circumstances are such that even with the PREA standards in place, you still find that in too many cases, people who are survivors of sexual abuse in detention are punished. If they're not punished in a formal sense, they're punished in the sense of how the abuse is responded to, right? So someone who is sexually abused too much of the time ends up being placed in some version of solitary confinement. It may be called protective custody, but they're put into conditions that essentially feel like solitary, where they are cut off from, any sort of positive, like friends, people that they might have in the facility, programming, jobs, things that may delay their ability to parole and to get out, things that may turn into long stints inside of inside of solitary housing, especially, because of like overcrowding conditions, et cetera. So instead of the sort of knee-jerk or automatic reaction being to isolate the perpetrator, or to just remove that staff perpetrator or that other incarcerated person who was the perpetrator from the situation, there are still too many times where the survivor is effectively punished. And that's what we saw here. Now, the abuse that happened to Ivory, that did happen some years ago. And I think what the story is, to kind of take from that, is that the process of implementing the PREA standards, the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards, and taking abuse seriously and making sure that the right policies and procedures are in place to ensure that someone can come forward and be treated in a trauma-informed way, that's the long game, right? So that's why JDI, we are technical assistance providers. Quite a lot of our time, of Nicole and I, we spend providing technical assistance to advocates, to corrections officials. So that's why we're doing this webinar, is because we want you all as the advocates to be able to advise someone, a survivor, when they tell you that something has happened to them and they're trying to figure out if they can report. And so much of the time, these are the reasons why a person would be afraid to report, because they've seen it. They've seen someone be abused and then be thrown in solitary, and lose all types of, privileges, programming, whatever it is inside that was making their lives a little bit bearable, then goes away. And at the moment where they are in the greatest trauma, in the greatest need for connection, for healing, they are put into, a situation of isolation, or they're not believed, or it's completely dismissed. So, all of those things can feel effectively like punishment and like a complete failure on the part of the corrections agency. So I hope that that answers that question. Okay, so to move forward here, we're going to talk about best approaches for supporting survivors, kind of against the backdrop of some of what we've talked about today. So some advocacy tips. So the first thing that you can do is what you're doing now. I mean, I've been so impressed with all of you today in terms of the types of responses, questions that you've shared. It shows, Nicole and I, that you guys really get it and you understand all of this quite deeply already. But continuing to learn more, right, is kind of the first advocacy tip. Understanding the dynamics of detention environments, being familiar with the detention facilities that you are working with, right? Hopefully you've had a tour of those facilities. Hopefully, and when I say tour, I don't actually like the word tour because it sounds very passive. What I mean is something, for lack of a better term, that feels more like a walkthrough, right? It feels more active, where you're seeing all areas of a facility. Hopefully you're getting to have some conversations with staff. You might even be able to have some interaction or exchange with incarcerated people, although that can be complicated. And hopefully what you have, and this is tough to come by, especially post-pandemic, is an active engagement in the facility that you're in. And so by having all of that, you understand the dynamics, and your knowledge of those dynamics is ever evolving, right? With the pandemic, with the staff shortages, with, the various realities that all of us, all of the stakeholders doing this work are facing. We know that your rape crisis programs are facing, unprecedented budget cuts, et cetera. So, those dynamics, what it looks like, whether people are getting help or not, those things, having an understanding of that is incredibly important. So detention environments often amplify the issues that we see in the broader community. And as Nicole mentioned, prisons and jails often have these hypermasculine environments that are an exaggeration and sort of harmful expression, the most harmful expressions, I think, of so-called, masculinity, where there's frequently an emphasis on physical strength and aggression and violence, and this deep-rooted discouragement of vulnerability, of emotional expression, of seeking help. And we know that racism also plays a strong role in detention environments. You've got racist ideologies, you've got historical narratives where this part of the criminal legal system has long been used to subjugate, to dehumanize and objectify people of color, and in particular, Black people, right? So having this knowledge is the base. We need to understand what we're dealing with, right, from the get-go, what it is and what it isn't. And detention can be an inherently triggering type of environment. We need to know that. And knowing these things helps us as advocates. It helps us to think through what those barriers are that the survivors we work with might be facing. So while it's not ideal when the staff at an organization, sorry, I wrote my note in a way that doesn't quite make sense to me now, but so even advocates who don't share an identity with the survivor can still be an effective support person for that survivor, is essentially what I'm trying to say. So just as advocates who are men can work with people who have experienced harm by men, women advocates can work with people who have experienced harm by a woman, regardless of whatever various identities you may hold as an advocate and as an individual, just know that it can impact how you are perceived, especially initially, so that it can be helpful to be prepared for that and be open to taking the additional time that you need to establish trust. And I can say more about that if there are questions. We often see at rape crisis centers and other advocacy organizations that there's only one person at an agency who is focused on working with incarcerated survivors. And this can be especially difficult when you're expected to be that sole resource in your agency and the rest of your staff isn't involved in the same way with this work. So getting all of your staff at least up to speed in some sort of foundational way to be able to do this work and to being committed to it and to understanding why it's important and that it's actually as central to your work as the work that you do with any other population of survivors, getting your board to understand that, all of that's important. So, if possible, we always recommend a team approach. We know that you all are, also incredibly under-resourced, understaffed. It's really tough times. But the more that you can have that team approach and you can be able to go to your colleagues, to your leadership when problems come up, when you need, to be able to step back, for example, and have some self-care, the better it's going to be for you and for survivors. Okay. And then, of course, at the same time, though, as it says on the slide, you do want to be a resource for your agency, right, and help them to kind of gain that more nuanced approach, because they may not realize that they need it. They may really think, oh, it's fine for this one person to be the advocate who does this work. Okay, then some language considerations. I had mentioned language earlier on in the presentation today, but just to kind of come back to some more specifics around that at this point. So the language that we use as advocates to promote our services and to reach survivors can really impact who ends up feeling like our services are for them. So what you want to think about is when people see, my agency that I work for, do they perceive it as a place that is for them, right? So using gender neutral language in trainings and advertisements is a good practice for many reasons. It helps us to be inclusive in our communication. It helps us to show that we serve all survivors of all genders, that we respect survivors who may use gender neutral pronouns, right? So for example, saying people of all genders or all survivors of any gender, that sort of terminology can help people to understand that oh, these are advocates who will see me for who I am. I don't have to feel like I have to leave myself at the door in order to go and get services here. So think about using gender neutral language. Think about the name of your agency. Does the name of your agency have woman in it? Or, even terms like rape. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but it's just kind of thinking about how is this likely to be perceived, and is there a shift or a change that we want to make to have it be clear that we are, as accessible, as that we're trying to reach as broad a swath, of all survivors as possible. So we find that the point that oftentimes men will only talk about experiencing sexual violence once a great deal of trust has been developed, right? So oftentimes a speaker may say she to describe a victim, and occasionally add, oh, and men too. Like, they may not talk about it as all survivors. And that can lead to a situation where that just adds to the stigma, that just adds to the lack of trust that men often will have kind of engaging in this system. And when you combine that with kind of everything that we talked about around toxic masculinity and what the identity, the sort of prevailing societal norms or pressures are, to be as a man. If your space doesn't feel welcoming, it's only adding to the ways in which society is already telling men and incarcerated survivors, quite frankly, that your services are not for them. Because even cisgender heterosexual women survivors have shared with us at JDI that they did not feel very welcomed when they went and sought services at programs in the community. So this is something that we can learn from across the board. And this last one's important. Don't limit your services to victims, quote unquote, or survivors of abuse. Think more broadly. I remember there was an advocate at a prison who was working at a prison. She was providing services at a prison in California. And she talked about how in order to reach more people there, because this was a facility for men, she specifically advertised her support group. She didn't advertise it as being for survivors of sexual abuse. She talked about it as being for, she talked about things like trauma. And within that, within kind of the longer description, she mentioned things like domestic violence, gun violence, community violence, substance use issues, things that hopefully a lot of men could see themselves in that, right? Maybe they were not survivors or don't see themselves as survivors of sexual abuse. But if you remind them of abuse or violence that they may have experienced or been subjected to in the community, perhaps in the context of gang violence or gun violence, that might be something that they are more apt to identify as, and that they are more apt to be ready to talk about. It's not so intensely personal and wrapped up in our expectations of what is a man and what is a real man and those types of things. So just some thoughts there. So tips for providing support. So, for all the reasons that I just said, right, you want to allow that additional time to establish trust. A lot of times when you're thinking about incarcerated survivors, you're thinking about people who not only have they often already had, multiple experiences of trauma, abuse across the lifespan, they've also had the experience repeatedly of being on the outside. Feeling like they were on the outside looking in, whether it's because they are people of color, poor, LGBT, have a disability, like all these groups are way overrepresented in detention. And so when you think about what it feels like to have multiple of those identities, and then to be in prison where you're already told that you are essentially subhuman and your identity is reduced to a number, a series of digits, to then think about how alienating that is, how isolating that is, how othering that is. And then you're held in facilities that are, far from where most of us spend our days. We're not thinking about the prisons. We might know where our jail is in our county, but we don't even really think about incarcerated people. So what does that do to people, in terms of their ability to trust, even if you do go in there as an advocate? Think about that, right? Think about how to build that trust, how to allow additional time, additional space. Develop a plan with the survivor for what happens between sessions, right? I mean, you see them, maybe you're going to see them again in a week or in a month or in a few weeks. But what does that look like in the meantime? And what plans, what safety planning can you do? What planning can you do around coping strategies? What sorts of coping strategies are accessible to them? You or I may be able to go take a bubble bath, but what can you do in detention, in your cell? Can you get out a piece of paper and safely journal? Can you get out, go out on the yard and have some sort of physical activity? Is there someone you can talk to, et cetera? Thinking realistically about what those things look like. And also allow time for decompressing after sessions. As a survivor myself, who was in therapy for a long time, I know that when sessions were over, right, by the time the session is over, you're typically very, you've kind of been through the ringer. If it's a session where you've talked a lot about things that you've been through and processing emotions, and maybe you're crying or you've just finished crying, think about when you have a session, allowing some time at the end to just decompress, for that survivor to come down a bit, so that when they leave that room, they can feel, if it's an in-person session, they can feel like, okay, I've composed myself, because it's very important in detention to be, to have control, right, over kind of the image that you're presenting to everyone. So not having someone leave your session just a couple minutes after they've been like pouring their heart out to you and crying is really important. Okay, what else do we have here? All right, so we want to address shame and stigma. We want to think about, again, right, we've talked about this, right, the shame and stigma associated with abuse perpetrated by women. So the feelings that someone willingly participated in the abuse can be greatly increased. Especially if they had a physical reaction, some sort of a sexual response during that abuse. And now once you have a strong rapport with a client, and when you can measure that, at their pace, it's okay to discuss that, you can respond by saying things like, there's absolutely no shame in what you experienced. Your physical reactions don't mean you wanted it. They don't mean that you consented to it. And those are the same things that we would tell survivors in the community, right? But it's really important. It becomes even more important in some cases to think about that in the detention context. And because of the perceptions about men having to be strong, what weakness looks like, quote unquote, it might also be helpful to process through any feelings someone may bring up about not feeling masculine enough, or feeling like their manhood, has been taken. You can emphasize that experiencing abuse does not make someone weak, that strength does not mean being perfect or invincible. If this is something a survivor wants to explore, you can discuss different aspects of healthy masculinity, such as emotional intelligence, self-care, healthy relationships. The other thing that you can do is acknowledge that it takes an incredible amount of strength and courage and bravery to step forward in a detention setting of all places, right? And say, help me, something happened to me, I need help. That's an incredibly brave thing to do. So as I mentioned before, many people, in particular men, don't feel comfortable labeling what happened to them as abuse. And we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to talk through what they experienced and come to their own understanding of what it is without us putting a label on that experience. And that can be hard because, well, at least I know for me, right? I'm not actually a victim advocate, but I would want to say, that was abusive. But it doesn't always work that way, right? It's not always the best thing to do. So for example, we had a person call our hotline who described this connection that he had with a woman staff member at a facility. And the more that he described it, the more that it became apparent to the advocate on our staff who took the call that what was happening was that the staff person was both coercive and abusive. And ultimately, the survivor ended up being transferred to a different facility because of the staff member's interactions with him. But the caller was not at a place in his own processing to say that what happened to him was abuse. And that was okay, right? The advocate did the right thing, gave him the space, the time to talk it out, share the impact and share the support of him without labeling that experience as abuse. And that's something that Nicole understands a lot better than I do about how to do that, because Nicole runs our hotline. So support can still be provided, even when a person does not label what happened to them as abuse. Okay. All right. And then, the final tip today that I'm going to share, and I promise I'll stop talking. We want to share that it may be helpful to have conversations with the survivors that you're in contact with about healthy relationships, because so much of the time they haven't had that modeled for them. Many facilities for women have classes and programming specifically around intimate partner violence, but it almost always is lacking in how to apply that to relationships between people who are incarcerated. So here you are in an incarcerated setting, you're getting some sort of programming about healthy relationships, but it's not addressing what is happening on the inside and what those relationships and interactions look like inside. So in facilities for women, you may have the opportunity to have, open and frank conversations about partnerships, relationships between women, and give information to the people you're working with, some space, some information and some space around, how do you deal with emotions like jealousy and anger, and especially when people are living in such, shared quarters where there's so little privacy. Now, in facilities for men, there often is programming that is focused on addressing violence against women, right? Combating violence against women. But again, those fail to cover situations where and talk about abuse against men by women. And many of the people incarcerated in facilities for men have expressed a strong interest in learning healthier relationship skills, how to build stronger support systems. And this can be a time for you to do that. And one thing I want to mention there is that many men who are incarcerated, who are survivors, they will, the first sort of the abuse, the sexual abuse that they will be most comfortable sharing about will be abuse that they experienced in childhood. And so that is something that you need to be prepared for. Doing this work is making sure you're prepared for those disclosures of childhood sexual abuse that are still deeply triggering for that person. Okay. I think, oh yeah, questions, great. Yeah, so I'll invite Nicole back in, and I don't know if anyone has any questions, or if there are any questions in the chat, or Nicole, anything that I missed that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think if folks do have any questions, now's the time to send them. So please do. But in the meantime, I'll just make a couple of announcements. But yeah, right now we don't have any open questions. We answered some on the chat function. But yeah, just a couple of announcements while we see if anyone has questions. If you're not already familiar with JDI's office hours, we have office hours every fourth Tuesday of the month. We'll be skipping December because of the holidays next week, in 2 weeks. But we will have our next office hours on January 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So make sure to put that in your calendar, and it'll also come, a reminder will come via email. But essentially, those are an open forum where Cynthia, myself, or one of our other colleagues at JDI helps facilitate just an open conversation with whoever joins about the work that folks are doing inside detention facilities, what challenges, what successes you might have, what questions you might have. So it's a great opportunity to just connect with us and with others who are doing this work. It's a great networking opportunity as well. So we welcome everyone who can join us. As we mentioned, this webinar is the third of a 13-part series focusing on underserved survivors. In the coming months, we'll have a few more webinars, so I just want to put those on your radar. The February webinar, which is, we don't have a specific date yet, but that'll be announced soon, is focused on supporting incarcerated survivors who are transgender men. And then in March, we'll have another webinar on supporting incarcerated survivors who are transgender women. I also just want to let everyone know about a coaching opportunity. If you're looking for individualized support for your agency and serving incarcerated survivors more generally, we're excited to offer this free and innovative coaching program that's aimed at helping survivor advocates from rape crisis centers, from multi-service agencies, and from coalitions, as well as corrections agencies, to expand their services for incarcerated survivors. So if you are interested, you can scan this QR code. I'll also put the link to the application on the chat. But yeah, each site that's chosen will complete an intake with us to identify what some of your goals are as they relate to serving formerly and currently incarcerated survivors. And then you'll receive 4-hour-long tailored coaching sessions to help you reach those goals. And again, this is completely free. So we encourage you to apply if your agency is interested. And then lastly, just want to share our information and remind you that we're here to support you in this work. So here's obviously our information to our website and how you can contact us. So yeah, hopefully folks are already following us and part of our email list, but if not, let us know and we can add you. And then let me go back and see, or I'll leave the slide here, but let me go back and see if there were any questions.
Yeah, there was a question, Nick, any advice for working with a client whose story is public? He is getting crap from those who are incarcerated with him.
Yeah, that is a tough one. So I think, in terms of the support that you provide, I mean, I'm sure that just having you as an advocate, and I see this question came from Alexandria, having an outside person there to listen, to provide a safe space for them to talk through those frustrations of what's going on, is a great, probably the most important thing you can do. Did you mean any advice specifically in terms of like providing advocacy? I mean, I think if you have their permission and they would want you to provide additional advocacy, I definitely think that could be a helpful next step is to talk to the facility, especially if it's public like that, that they should be taking precautions to ensure that the person is safe, and that they're not being getting crap, as you said, from other incarcerated people. So I'm not sure if that's sort of the type of advice you were looking for, but I think that, again, depending on your agency's policies around confidentiality and whether you need to get their written permission, but talking to them about any advocacy at the agency level that you could do for them, I think would be a good next step.
And then Skyla, you asked about YouTube videos or documentaries about incarcerated men or male survivors in general. So all of the links that I've just put in 5 YouTube links, those are all videos featuring formerly incarcerated male survivors, including one who is in South Africa, who works with folks in our South Africa office in Johannesburg. Is the webinar going to be shared afterwards? Yes, it will be. Nicole, it'll be posted on our website, right? In a couple weeks, I think.
Yeah, it'll take a couple weeks to just get the recording with the interpretation and the captioning. But yes, they will all be posted soon on our website. And
Great.
we can also make an announcement on whenever they're ready, we can make an announcement and send it to our email list as well. So if you're a part of that,
Oh, great.
you'll get a notification.
Okay, Liz. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicole.
Nope, just send us your email, Lisbeth. You can do so on the chat or to one of us privately, and we'll make sure you get added to our email list. And I promise we don't send a lot of emails, so we won't spam you.
And then I see our colleague Tara Graham chimed in and said, or the crap they're getting is retaliation. There's supposed to be protections for that. Absolutely. Oh yeah, how can I be added to the mailing list? Just put your email in there. Great. So let's see. I don't see the links. Thank you. Yeah, if you scroll up a little bit, Skyla, you will see a series of YouTube links that I posted, CT. So just scroll up a bit on the thing, or just reach out to me. I'll put my email in here and you can reach out directly and ask me to send them to you. We'll save this chat so that we can do that. Okay, great. Anything else, or should we wrap up, Nicole?
I think we can wrap up. I'm happy to stay until the end of the session, so a couple more minutes in case folks have questions. But I think otherwise, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, shout out to our interpreters. Thank you for adding that, Laura. They are amazing. Will the PowerPoint presentation, will we be able to get? Yeah, so once the recordings are posted, if you don't see the link to the PowerPoint presentations, we can certainly send that to you as well. But we usually do put a PDF version of the slides with the recording.
Yeah, thank you, Skyla, for being here. You have a great day as well.
All right, I don't think we were going to get any more questions, so I'm happy to end here, and I think folks can reach us if they have any questions via email. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.